Is this? Yes, always the important test. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us here this afternoon, Conservative Home in partnership with Age UK, to discuss maybe one of the biggest challenges facing the government, how to fix social care. Everyone knows we need to do it. Nobody really seems to have agreed how to do it. It is going to involve, it already has involved some controversial tax increases. Is that money enough? Is that money going to get where it needs to go? These are some of the questions that we're going to be looking at this evening. Joining us this afternoon, good Lord, sorry. all of the, when you've been inside this long and the electric lighting, it all just looks the same. This afternoon, joining me this afternoon is Gillian, Keegan, the Minister for Care, Councillor Louise McKinlay, member of the LGA's Community Wellbeing Board, kindly stepping into the shoes of James Jameson, who is not here, and then Caroline Abrahams, the Charity Director of Age UK. It's standard format, I'm sure you're all used to it by now. Each of our panellists will speak for about 5 minutes and then we'll throw the floor open to questions. So without further ado, kicking us off, Caroline.
Thank you very much. Hi everybody, thanks ever so much for coming today, and a special thanks to the Minister on week 2. I think that's pretty brave actually, but I know we're going to be a very friendly crowd for Gillian to be talking to, so that's going to be good. I wanted to start off by saying how exciting really it was when we knew that the Prime Minister was going to actually make an announcement about social care. For a lot of people who worked in social care, you know, they've been up and down that hill many, many times and ultimately been disappointed and no announcements being made. So it was a really important moment, and I think it really is a very important moment for social care because it's sort of broken the political logjam. You know, I think people like me who talk to politicians on all sides, it's not unusual to hear backbenchers in any party saying, oh, social care, far too difficult, don't know what the answer is. And a bit of a sense, really, of Westminster giving up on it. So the fact that the Prime Minister has done something is really, really important. And it opens up the field and gives us, people like me and my colleagues, a fantastic platform to build from. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Has he done the right thing? Is he spending his political capital and all that money on the right things? Well, he's decided, and he was very clear about this in advance, that the centrepiece of what he wanted to do was a cap on costs. And there's absolutely no doubt that if you are one of those people who needs care for a long time in a care home, perhaps because you have dementia or a neurological condition, it can eat up an immense amount of money. I mean, literally wipe you out. And I think something like 15 people a day run out of money. And that may not sound very much, but cumulatively, it's a lot. And it's something that many, many more older people worry about, that might happen to them. And then, of course, if it does, not only have you not got anything to pass on to your family, but what happens to you now? Will you be able to stay in the care home that you call home, or will you be moved somewhere else that might not be so good? So it is an important issue. There's no doubt about that. But from what we can see, the money that's going to be raised by the national insurance hike, initially, of course, going to NHS, may or may not actually make it to social care. There's some scepticism being expressed by some about that. But let's assume it is. Let's assume it does come through. The problem is it doesn't really arrive until October 23 at the earliest. And then, actually, it's mainly there to pay for the cap. And the problem, of course, is in the meantime, there's lots and lots of people in the system now, and others who would love to be in the system but can't get a service. And they need more help now. We're seeing the workforce. It's not new that there are vacancies in the social care workforce, but providers, you know, you might say, well, they would say this, wouldn't they? But they're pretty clear that actually things are as bad or worse now than they've ever seen them. And there's plenty of other jobs at the moment that are fishing in the same pond for them. So we need to do more on the workforce. There was 500 million announced for the workforce. That is great, and it's going to help with particularly, I think, qualifications and skills. And I'm sure the Minister might want to say a bit about that as a former apprenticeships minister. That is really important. But it doesn't actually put any more money into a social care person's pocket. And of course they are, as they're pointing out, also going to pay a bit more NI. So actually, you know, a bit more incentive to keep them would help. But even more, really, I worry about councils and the position they're in. You know, it's great to have a councillor here today who I'm sure her council, politically and at officer level, does everything they can to provide a great service to their local disabled people and older people. But it's really hard at the moment, and costs are going up, and the money hasn't. And we know there's a big funding gap. So this is all to say, to come to the conclusion, in our view anyway, at Age UK, that what really is needed is a generous settlement for local government from the spending review, which Mr Sunak's going to announce in a few weeks' time. And of course, there are many pressures on the Exchequer at the moment. But the risk is, if we don't buoy up social care now, that actually by October 23, when the cap is due to come in, local government's not going to be in a great state to be able to implement it. So for us, actually, it's never just about the money, but the money is really important. Final comment, two other things are going to come, which will help us see a lot more about what the government's plan really is. We've only had a little bit of it so far. And that's the two white papers that the government's announced. It intends to publish by Christmas. One on social care quality, really important. Technology, housing, support for carers, all sorts of different things are going to be in that, we know. But also, just as important, integration with the NHS. And for older people, particularly frail older people living at home or in a care home, getting your health and your social care joined up and enough people and working well together, absolutely imperative. It makes all the difference, keeping people fit and well. So certainly at Age UK, we're going to be helping, challenging and supporting officials and ministers and everybody to try and get the most out of these two really good opportunities. But above all, we're cheering on Rishi Sunak. We want him to be the hero who comes to the rescue of social care. And that will help fulfil the Prime Minister's promise too. Thank you.
Thank you. Louise.
Thank you. And if I could just also start by welcoming the announcement and thanking the government for actually starting a proper conversation on this. It's been kicked down the road too many times, and the very fact that we're actually here today with something on the table that's a proper discussion and a proposal, I think, is something we should all very much welcome. But we shouldn't pretend that that's the end of the conversation, because as I see it, it's just the start, and it's not without risk. Two reasons, really. I think, firstly, on the political side, I think we have to make sure that there is a clear understanding in the public of what is actually being offered here. We talk about the cap of the 80,000, but what does that mean? It's obviously about the care itself. It doesn't cover the board and lodgings aspect. And of course, depending on the value of your property, that may in reality mean that you do have to sell it to fund the care. And that obviously brings into question, as Caroline rightly says, what it is that you're leaving your children, grandchildren, and I think, many thoughts that as Conservatives, a lot of us would hold dear around, how you pass on what it is that you've worked hard for all your life. So it's a very difficult one from a political perspective as well. But as I say, I very much welcome the fact that we have had the announcement. In terms of the implementation, and we all want to make this a success, let's be clear on that. But I do think that there is some urgent clarification that is needed, particularly around the transition. And that's really what I meant about it being the start of the conversation. So what does the profile of the 15% look like? We've had the verbal assurance that once the money has obviously gone initially to the NHS, that will move over to social care. But what does that look like? How do we guarantee it? Are there discussions around at least a floor for what social care will have? And I think there's a broader discussion there about what the implications for the NHS will be at the end of the 3 years. There's also the financial considerations. So we obviously, as a local authority, 2/3 of our budget goes on social care, and very much welcome the fact that the direct costs around the increase in national insurance will be met. But where you are commissioning services, and those costs are therefore within the line as well, and with the providers, there's obviously a much broader conversation around that as well. And then the fact that people who currently self-fund can now, or will be able to come to us, and we can obviously help source the care for them, and appreciating that that's a positive in some ways because of the imbalance, the unfairness around the cost that a local authority may be able to source a place in a care home for versus the cost that somebody privately would pay. But there is the reality around that as well, that from the care home provider's perspective, that's going to have to be considered and think about how they're going to recuperate that. So I do worry that there will overall be an increase in the cost of those places for the local authorities. And then I think the final point I would make is that we are very much talking about care homes for older people here, and social care is much broader than that. We have 4,500 people who are of working age in Essex who have learning disabilities. The cost associated with supporting them is huge, it's significant. It's absolutely an area that we are focused on, not just from a statutory responsibility perspective, but also looking at what that can mean around life chances and helping people to be as independent as they possibly can be. But that comes at a cost. So I think there's a much broader piece here that we have to consider around social care. and what that means in the longer term for how we can, as I say, take what I think is a very positive start to the conversation, but turn that into something that's much more fundamental. And I'll just follow on from what Caroline was saying around the issues around recruitment and pay, which, when you compare what somebody can earn as a care worker versus what they can earn stacking shelves in the local supermarket, it's not surprising that we are in a place where we are suffering from retention and recruitment. So I think that absolutely has to be looked at in the longer term if we really are going to be able to crack the very difficult nut of social care and make sure that that can be as comprehensive but also as sustainable as it can be for all of us into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Gillian.
Thank you very much, and thank you for letting me go last and listen to what you had to say first. So first of all, the role that I have it's kind of constructed a bit differently, recognising some of the challenges that we have to overcome. So it's care, mental health, and integration. And I think it is important that those are together, particularly when we look at working age adults, as you say, having care and mental health together makes massive sense, but also for older people, having that integration piece, because the systems today are under way too much pressure. And we all see that, whether you look at it from the council's perspective, from the care home's perspective, from the workers' perspective, or most of all, for the people who are in the care system. And most people, and more people, are aware of how unfair the system is today. Now, many of us were involved in this political hot potato, which has, sort of been passed from time to time, and nobody's really wanted to grip it, because it is controversial. It does have elements of, depending on what wealth you have, you do still have, some contribution to make, and that can be a large part of your assets to some degree. But the system today, everybody, I think, is getting more and more aware of how unfair it is. And if you've ever gone into the system, it is just full of anxiety. And 15 people a day running out of money is something that Caroline mentioned. And one of them was my grandmother. So both my grandmothers had dementia. One of them stayed in her own home. But she had 13 children, 11 of whom survived till adulthood, and all of them lived within a couple of miles, a proper Liverpool Catholic provision. But that's not necessarily sustainable, and I don't know many other people who are in her situation. My other grandmother lived alone until pretty much till she was 93, and then, as often comes the case, you get to the point where you're wandering off in the middle of the night, thinking you're a 40-year-old mother looking for your kids, as opposed to a 93-year-old when your kids are in your 70s. And so eventually she did have to go into a home, and she had to sell all her assets. She lived in a council house all her life, which she bought under the Right to Buy scheme. She still wasn't that thankful to Margaret Thatcher, but we disagreed politically, let's just say. Anyway, it was all recycled back. And she got to the point where she had pretty much got to the end of her assets. She sold her house for £57,000. So she would have actually benefited from this system. And she obviously, all of it went. And got to the point where two things had become apparent. The first was her and Maud knew they were paying to basically 50% more than everybody else who was paid for by Knowsley Council. They knew that, and everybody else knew that. The families know that. So more and more people are going to be aware of the unfairness, and they'll be absolutely, rightly, very unhappy when they find out. The other thing she didn't know is whether she could stay in the room, whether she could stay in the house, whether she could stay in the home, because of course then the council is going to fund. And imagine that, you've reached nearly 96 years old. You've paid every penny you've ever made from your very modest lifestyle of working in a biscuit factory. And she then doesn't even know if she can stay in the room. And that she did die actually not long after that. So we didn't really have to confront all of those horrors. But I do have many people who come into my surgeries, into my constituency, into my office with this at the front of their mind. They've run out of their assets, and they then say, do I have to move? And actually in Chichester, quite often they do. We actually even have homes in Chichester that refuse to take council any council, because they just don't want to have that two rates, and they obviously are looking for the sort of higher earning market. That's not the situation in Knowsley because it's very different demographically. So today it is unbelievably unfair, and I think the Prime Minister's been incredibly brave. You know, we were all, I was a candidate in 2017. It was when I was first elected in that election when this was tried last time, and it was a complete nightmare because most people actually didn't know the current system. It was just dropped out of nowhere, and the worry and concern was obviously the election results sort of absolutely, it was on the doorstep that this was the reason why Theresa May lost her majority in that election. And by the way, if you came in that election, the next 2 years that followed were because we were in a hung parliament. So there was a lot of consequences to trying it last time. So it is brave to do it, but it's absolutely necessary. It's the right thing to do. It has been controversial, but we're going to grasp it. And, you know, I've been asked to do this role, and I feel incredibly privileged, actually, to be coming at it at this point. When, yes, there are still issues. We still do have to resolve some of the big issues. The workforce is a big issue. As a very new MP, I set up an APPG with Louise, a Labour MP, on the professionalising the social care workforce. I have one of my best friends who's worked in the social care system all her life in Knowsley, and she made me do it because she made me see how unfair it was, how it doesn't work as a proper system. Everybody's retraining people. There isn't a proper understanding of the skills, transferability of skills. There's massive 0 hours contracts. How you can have that level of 0 hour contracts when you've got such churn and such insecurity. The insecurity passes down to the individual. I've been meeting domiciliary care workers who tell me if they're people they look after go into hospital, their salary gets affected for that week. How can you possibly, when you're on a minimum wage, deal with that situation? It's ridiculous, and that is it makes it all worse. The sector doesn't help itself, actually, from those perspectives as well. Everybody needs security in their work, and you need security even more if you are at the lower income scale, because you have absolutely nothing to play with. The professionalisation, the job they do, they have a lot of skills that is not recognised. They're not recognised. Everybody sees it in the care home, but when you go to the next one, you know, there's nothing that says these are all the things I can do that are akin to a lot of the nursing skills as well. So we do need to definitely look at professionalising. And one of the things I did do as apprenticeships and skills minister was work with the sector and also the health sector to have these routes, 70 routes actually, apprenticeship routes at all levels, to make sure that we can capture the learning and capture the professionalism and then make that transferable, and also have career progression routes within the system. It's really important that we do that. I think it's clear that there's a lot of anxiety over the money and where it comes from in the future. Obviously, we've got 5.4 billion. It's 5.4 billion, which is a lot of money, which is a lot of money more than we've had in the past. But of course, the objective is to make sure at the end of this 3 years, once the electives and the capacity is built, because we're actually looking to get some residual increase in capacity as a result of that in the NHS, that we will then have a much bigger a portion of that levy, and that levy will continue. And obviously, what we have to make sure is that levy continues, and it continues to underpin this system that we're going to build. We need to innovate. There's not much innovation in the sector. I don't really blame the sector for that, because when you're sort of trying to run to keep up, it's very difficult to look at what's wrong and to look at how we fix it. We need to make some very good inroads into that through the integration of health and social care. We've all seen this. We've all seen the impact it has on the NHS when the social care system doesn't work seamlessly together with and it doesn't pretty much anywhere today. It went probably a little bit better during the second lockdown, possibly. It's probably the best we've ever been, but it didn't work up to that point, and therefore we do have to do that. I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic for several reasons. First of all, we all desperately want it. Secondly, we all desperately need it. Thirdly, I think the sector is going to be a very good sector to work with. I've already, even in the first 2 weeks, seen that. You know, It's got that pragmatic as well as truly caring, plus knowing what it's solving for. You've stared at these issues for a long time, and I think appreciate the opportunity we have to work together to fix them. Our case is to look at everything. The innovation in supported living, that's not good enough. You look at the best models in the world. I want the best system in the world. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't. We've got a National Health Service. That's a lot for us to pin and underpin around this system as well. And we do have to look at how we can innovate. Downsizing. I remember I was once asked on my way into being an MP, you have to do an assessment. And I was once asked, what was the policy that you would most disagree with, the Conservative Party policy? And you would vote against the government. And that was like a test. And I answered the bedroom tax. And the reason I answered the bedroom tax is not because I was against the principle of it, but there was absolutely no properties for anybody to downsize, to go to a 1 or 2 bedroom solution, and therefore it didn't work. And that's the same with our elderly people today. If you want to downsize, if you want to get somewhere that's much better place for you to live, they're simply not available. So there's an awful lot that we need to do. Every part of the system needs incrementally improving, and I very much look forward to working with the sector to doing that. I don't have much experience in the sector, but I have a lot of personal experience of what happens when you're in this situation. But I also have a lot of business experience. I've worked for nearly 30 years, and I like to implement things that fix problems basically and find solutions. And I think that's possibly why I've been given the job. That's kind of that's the experience I come with, and also I'm very determined to our elderly people. I've always had a fabulous I grew up with great grandmothers as well as all my grandparents, and I've always had a fabulous relationship with every old person in my family. And dignity when you get older is the most important thing, but also working age adults. I have a nephew who's 14 with Down syndrome. And obviously what's happened is many people now with these learning disabilities will live for a lot longer. He might outlive his parents, he possibly will. He'll probably outlive me. And how he's going to be looked after when he needs that extra support when he's older is also something that keeps us all awake at night, actually. Now I'm from a very big Liverpool Catholic family that recreates itself a lot. So there's probably people who will help looking after him, but that's not the case for many people. And I think that's also something that we really have to make sure as a society we have many more people living with many more disabilities, hidden or the disabilities that you can see, and will need that extra support. And as a society, dignity in old age and making sure that everybody has their best chance of living their best life is that would be a great legacy to leave.
Wonderful. Okay, so this is where we throw open the discussion. We've got a full house, so a few house rules. First off, questions, not statements. I know everyone says it, we really do mean it. Second, questions that don't really need lots of preamble. Ideally, we've got an expert panel. If they can't answer your question without an awful lot of setup, you might be asking the wrong question or the wrong panel. And third, please stick to 1 or 2 questions. If you stand up and say, I've got 3 unrelated questions, I might have to throw my pen at you. With those rules in place, we'll start with Robert in the front row and the lady in the front row over there. Thank you. Oh, have you only got 1 microphone?
We've got 2.
Oh, cool, perfect.
Can you just say you are as well, because I won't know.
Yes,
you know Robert, I don't know Robert.
Absolutely.
I like his glasses, but I don't know him.
All right, thank you.
Robert.
Thank you, and thank you for the compliment about the glasses.
Yeah, very nice.
I wear them to embarrass my children. It's a key part of being a father. I'm Robert Cllr. I've been a care home operator for over 32 years. I'm optimistic and hopeful on the recent announcement, and government should be congratulated for having the courage to do this. 10 years on from Dale Note, no more dithering, it's good. But yes, it's a good start, but the devil will be in the detail, as has been talked about, all the different issues. Because the 2 key problems in the care home sector at the moment are staffing and funding. So the funding you've been talking about, but the staffing is, and you also have mentioned the staffing, but the current big problem in care homes and staffing is the mandatory double jabbing by law coming in the 11th of November. Care homes in England are currently losing staff who won't don't want to be double jabbed to NHS England. Now, if it's the right thing to do, which I accept the government have decided, and Sajid Javid said recently, your boss said recently on Saturday, that if you're not prepared to get double jabbed, working with vulnerable elderly people in care homes, get another job. Well, fine. But why doesn't that apply to NHS England and to home care? Because if my granny is in a care home being looked after by double jabbed people, then she has to go into hospital and she's being looked after by people that aren't double jabbed.
Thank you. We're doing two questions at once. So.
Hello, Jessica Hill, Local Government Chronicle. We're hearing a lot of speculation that the government is going to lift the referendum cap on the social care precept, which would mean that councils can effectively raise more money, as much money as they like, potentially, to pay for social care because of the fact that the money from the levy isn't going to come in until October 2023, and there's a massive crisis at the moment. So if that does happen, I don't know how that sits with the government's levelling up ethos, because the problem is that surely that would mean that areas where house prices are higher, councils can potentially raise a lot more money for social care than areas where they can potentially raise less money through council tax. So can you answer that question, please?
Wonderful. So if we start with Gillian and just move down the panel, I think it's probably easier.
Okay. So firstly, Robert, your question, I mean, I don't think, well, hopefully nobody misunderstands why we've put that in place in terms of the double jabs. What you're actually asking is, why is it not good for all the other frontline care workers as well, which is the right question and is a good question. And, you know, we have launched a consultation on that, and there is a process that's ongoing with both the NHS and domiciliary care workers. So, you know, I don't want to prejudge what that's going to be, but I think the logic that you argue is something that will obviously be considered, and that's why we've launched the consultation. So timing may be different, but there is a process we're going through to answer that question. And in terms of your question, obviously I don't know and can't prejudge what the Chancellor's going to come up with in the budget, but your point is about if you're using council tax. I have a great example of this, because I grew up in Knowsley, which is effectively a lot of council estates and a small amount of private housing, and I'm the MP for Chichester, which is effectively a whole load of private housing with a couple of council estates that are tiny and have cows in the fields next to them. They're not even similar to any of the council estates that I grew up with. And that is the question. And you know, what has happened, and I was a councillor actually on a bid to try and turn myself from a business person into a politician to get that understanding. And it's an obvious question, you know, how are you going to get the money for Knowsley? And actually what happens though is there's a lot of other funding that gets reverted. There was a revenue support grant which used to go from one to the other. I know Chichester pays a lot into that. Knowsley's a huge recipient of that. And I would imagine that those things will continue for a period of time, because that's understood, right? That's how it's dealt with. Although, you know, there's an awful lot of pressure on council funding, because effectively the statutory duties, the demographic change and the impact that's had has meant that social care, working age adults and elderly people is now getting to be quite a considerable part of most councils' budget. And that's changed and gone up, which is why we do need to put all this in place before. We can't just watch that, because it's clearly demographically where it's going to end. So there'll be some short-term things which aren't perfect, whilst we work together to make sure that we get a medium and longer term sustainable system that is much better and much fairer.
Louise?
Yeah, just coming back on the funding point, because we're obviously talking about social care here, but social care precepts, council tax increases, there's only so far any council can realistically go in terms of increases, and obviously that whole budget delivers the council services. So in Essex, it's over 2/3 of our budget is focused on social care, but then we very quickly get into conversations with the public about, you know, the wretched potholes that come up every time you knock on someone's door, and all of the other priorities that we have with, you know, a huge levelling up agenda that we're about to launch. So when we're talking about precepts, and this comes back really to the point I was making about, I think, the understanding of the public of how social care is funded in reality, because everyone's just seen, you know, the headlines. They're then going to get their council tax bills that, you know, potentially has an increase in social care precept, and be thinking about what that may mean for the broader budgets of councils. So it's when you look at it in the entirety, it's, you know, it really does impact on everything that councils do as to how we can square off that circle from a financial perspective.
A lot of warm agreement on this panel, I'm afraid. I don't like the precept either. Of course, social care needs more money now, but for us it would be a pretty rotten way of responding to the need. It's open to local political interpretation. As you say, some places can raise more than others, so it's unfair. And it's too uncertain, really, for an essential public service that really needs proper funding, and that means funding from the centre. So we'll look forward to see what Mr Sunak actually announces, but we're strongly urging him not to go down the precept route, but to give a proper slug of money to social care instead.
I'm going to abuse Chair's prerogative for a second, because we've just touched on something which I'm quite interested in, which is the fairness about how we raise this money and the demographic challenge facing the government on this. The social care precept was not uncontroversial because of what it did to the marginal tax rates facing working age, and especially younger working age people. And then we've got the news now about the cut to tuition fee repayment thresholds. So is this a problem facing the government? Do you think that, how sustainable or fair is it in the long term to keep pushing up tax rates on working age people in order to shield asset wealth in order to fund social care?
I mean, that's the thorny question, right? That's been the thorny question all along. And it's about getting the right balance, actually. You know, obviously, I mean, I wasn't actually involved in, you know, all the various things that were looked at. And I've asked all the questions, you know, did you look at a percentage? Did you look at this? Did you look at that? Actually, everything was looked at. Every single option was looked at, and every single one of them had pros and cons. And effectively, I think in terms of the public's mind, and this is only as a layperson, I think the national insurance, there's two things that it does. One is it's businesses that pay as well. And actually businesses, I think sort of the larger businesses will pay 70% of the you know, the top businesses in the country. So there's that element of it. But it's also, I think, in the public's mind, sort of trusted more as something that will be ring-fenced, that will be for this purpose, as opposed to general taxation. And I think that's the place that national insurance has in people's mind, and a lot of the sort of polling showed that as well. But you know, the reality is, when you're taking money from you know, in taxes, and when you're looking at trying to get that balance right, it's incredibly difficult. I often have this conversation because, you know, there is still 86,000, as you said, which could, in some cases, be a reasonable chunk of somebody's assets. I think maximum it can be is about 30 odd percent, but it's still, you know, could be 30 odd percent, whereas it could be 0.3% for somebody else, right? You know, it does have that impact. But as I say to many people, you know, you've got to get the balance right between having a simple system that everyone can understand and kind of trust in, and trying to get that sort of intergenerational thing. I think there's two elements here that have convinced me. The first is, you said about, you know, the houses and houses. You know, I have this conversation a lot in Chichester, which is, let's be honest, most of our houses have been more successful than we have for our lives, you know, and you know, when we say it's our hard-earned money and whatever, there is an element of that, but there is an element also where we have gone through the most incredible housing boom that didn't happen for the generations before. Definitely won't happen for the generations in front of us. And, you know, our houses have probably more, as I say, been more successful than most of us in our lifetime. We just have to acknowledge that, particularly in Chichester and places like that. It's probably less so in Knowsley. As I say, my nan's house went for 57 grand a couple of years ago. So, you know, that's different. But, you know, also half of this money is for working age adults. And I think that intergenerational, first of all, I don't believe anybody who's younger doesn't care about getting the right system in place for the elderly. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's a huge relief to anybody who's younger who's actually going to be looking after the next generation and having to go through all of these difficult decisions on behalf of people they love. But secondly, we all know there's a high, you know, there's such success now in terms of our medical advance that there's a lot of people living with more complex needs who we need to support in our society, and we want to support in our society. So half the money actually does go for working age people as well. So it's not really an intergenerational thing. It's about doing the right thing for people who need it.
Okay. Right, let's go back to the floor. So I have the gentleman there, and then the gentleman in the second row there. Thank you.
Hi, John Perriman from Carers UK. Minister, you'll be aware, and you've spoken about the vital role that millions of unpaid carers play in supporting family and friends. Can you say anything about the forthcoming white paper with regard to unpaid carers and the support that they might be able to expect in the future? And do the panel agree that we do need to support 13.6 million carers more?
So.
Yeah, John Pring from Disability News Service. The almost universal criticism across the disabled people's movement on the plan, to the inadequate level of funding, failure to address the needs of working age disabled people, the lack of detail, disproportionate impact of the plans on lower income workers. I mean, that was pretty universal across the movement, certainly as regards working age people. So how do you respond to those criticisms?
So if we start with Caroline this time and work up the other way.
Okay, yeah, well, on carers, of course, I'd agree. Absolutely, and it'll be really interesting to see what the white paper can come up with. I think one of the things that's happened through the pandemic is we've got a bit more used as a society to the idea of flexible working, and that's got a lot to offer carers. A lot of women particularly, but some men too, in midlife and later life, they're trying to balance a job with looking after a loved one. And the more flexible their job can be, and if they're able to apply for a job that's advertised as flexible from the start, the easier it is for them to keep going. And it's in everybody's interest for them to keep going. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And just a word on the intergenerational issue. I actually agree with the Minister. I think any of us could need social care at any point in our lives. It isn't just for older people. It could happen to any of us, sadly. So really, on that basis, we all ought to make a contribution to funding it. And at Age UK, you'd be amazed or not to know that we would have been perfectly happy for there to have been a contribution to the cost that was more than just a tiny bit of national insurance for those older people who choose to work past state pension age. I think when we've talked to older people, people generally understand that it is they would be up for making a contribution. I mean, it's easy to say that when you ask them. I know politicians always say when it comes to election time, no one wants to spend to give any more money to tax. So I do understand that constraint. But actually, arguably, something on death would have been the best way of doing it for lots of people in the sector. But of course, totally understand the political difficulty around that. But rising house prices have got a lot to answer for in this debate. They're partly why this is such a difficult debate, because the amount now that people are leaving, particularly in London and the South East, is life-changing for their the younger people in their families. And that creates some problems and issues over this debate, I think.
Louise?
So I think the unpaid carers are obviously, for many, the bedrock, aren't they, of need within a family, and the support that we as a society should give them, and frankly the recognition, I think is often underrated. I'm absolutely, again, with Caroline on the flexible working. I was at an event a couple of weeks ago where we were very much talking about what flexible working could mean for families with young children and what that means in the space of childcare. But of course, caring responsibilities don't just stop when your children grow up. For many, it's more complex and goes right the way across life. So I do think there is absolutely more that we can do there to support businesses and employers to recognise the importance of flexibility and the impact that can have on helping their workforce take care of their responsibilities.
Gillian?
I mean, definitely, I completely agree. The unpaid carers, whether they're caring for elderly relatives or for children with additional needs. As I mentioned, my nephew who's 14 and my sister-in-law who, devotes a fair chunk of her time to helping make sure that he is well supported and happy. And we all have seen, the massive it's absolutely the bedrock of everything. Without the unpaid carers, we'd be completely lost. So recognition of that, I think, is really, really important. But in addition, and I think of this, and I particularly think of it when I think of my sister-in-law as well, what sort of things does she need? I think the support in the community is really, really important, and we need to get better support in the community, particularly for certain groups. Technology, I'm quite hopeful that technology is going to actually help and help ease some of the burden at times that unpaid carers have, and the flexibility, I think, is an important part of that, and technology can help with that as well. I also think respite and having that sort of ability to have a break, take a break, is also very important. And I'm very interested as well in some of the things that we can do in our communities. You know, Chichester, we're trying to become a dementia-friendly city. And when you speak to anybody, particularly in those first few years of diagnosis with dementia, the difference that would make to their partners, who inevitably become their carers from that moment, is massive. And actually, if you speak to people in that situation, that's all they want, really. They really just want a bit of respite, a little bit of help, you know, somewhere that they could know that their other half is safe while they go off and do something for a few hours even. That makes a massive difference. So I think there's all things that we can improve. I haven't looked specifically at the disability response. So far, all the sector has actually responded very positively about you know, because they recognise that it, first of all, was brave, and secondly, it was necessary, and thirdly, no one else has done it so far, and therefore it is important to get a grip. But I don't know if there's specific things that you know, that have come from that lobby. But obviously, I'll be working with the disability rights people to understand those better. But on the whole, I think we've had very positive support from the sector.
Thank you. I should just say at this point, because I think I forgot to earlier, if you're tuning in on the party programme, you can send me questions and they'll appear on my laptop and I will ask them. So please take the time to do that, because there's no reason that people in here should have all of the fun. Anyway, show of hands. We'll have... No, I already asked you, sorry. We'll have the lady in the second row there and the lady in the third row there, please.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask about the other part of the social care budget, the working age adults. So I'm a charity trustee for a charity for adults with autism and learning disabilities. And we find that lots of people turn up who aren't diagnosed with a learning disability, but they have got a lot of problems and they get no access to social care. So, for example, there's a guy that's applied for 800 jobs and can't stay in a job because they think he doesn't mix well with other people. Well, he's autistic. And then there's another lady who clearly has some sort of learning disability, and she has to work because she's not getting any access to social care. And she gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning, gets on a bus, goes to work at big events like this, cleaning the toilets, and then goes home, gets back about midnight, and pays for the travel to and from. So I'm just interested to know your thoughts on what happens to those people on the edges, the vulnerable, marginal people.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Emma Basie and I work for Sue Ryder. I suppose my question is around hospice care, but also around what the charitable sector provides that actually is a massive buffer for the social care system and the NHS, and how that fits into, I think, what you've spoken about looking at things in the round with things like innovation and recruitment is really important, but the charitable sector has really provided that possibility, I think, for a lot of the sector to continue to operate. And how will those services which are in crisis, I think 1 in 5 was at risk of closure before the pandemic, and the money that the government gave to hospice care was vital. It stopped us closing, but how do we have a sort of sustainable solution for the future, and how does that fit into the overall landscape?
Thank you. Let's start with Gillian and work down.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, learning disabilities, in particular autism. I was very shocked when I stood in St Helens in 2015, and Rob over there helped me right at the beginning of my political journey. And we met, I don't know if you remember, Rob, we met the head of the local autism charity, and he was autistic himself, and he took me through the figures of the amount of barriers and difficulties to get in employment. And when he looked, he really explained it to me that, you know, every job description pretty much is like the worst nightmare of anyone with autism to be able to succeed in. It's like if you put everything that you're going to find a bigger hurdle, and that's in every job description, with relationships, with, you know, people skills, all of the things that you would test. And it's led to really poor outcomes for a lot of people who effectively just need adjustment in the workplace to be able to be, you know, performing and enjoying and partaking. And I think, you know, we are obviously focused, and we are going to have an autism strategy. Well, we have an autism strategy. We're going to start to work to implement that. That has got to be at the centre of it, because most people want to work. Most people want to have a good job, a decent job, and actually not to be exploited, which it sounds like the other example that you gave is in that situation. So I think we do have a lot of work, and I look forward to working with the autism charities, because it struck me ages ago as a massive waste. One of the things I think that's going to be helpful, okay, we've had a few disruptions and you know, sort of problems with the supply chains as a result of the pandemic and the global pandemic, but actually we were facing a massive skills shortage anyway. And, you know, whether it's, you know, like Brexit or any of those things, actually mostly it's about what people are training for, and and where the skills are that we need, and the disconnect in those. And therefore, for the first time in a long time, because we have very, very low unemployment figures, even after all this disruption, companies are going to have to work a lot harder to actually get talent, train talent, and retain talent. And that's a good thing, actually. It's a good thing. It's a good thing for pay as well. And people will start to, I think, look more, you know, how can I generate? And I think that people with autism is a huge opportunity for most businesses, and many businesses are getting a sort of figuring this out, I think, even now. And yes, the hospices and all the the charitable, you know, again, with the unpaid carers, the other, I wouldn't say they're unsung heroes, because I think everybody locally absolutely loves all their local charities. I mean, you know, we do everything for our local charities, our local hospices, and our local support services that really help people in need. And they are the most successful charities, I think, locally, because that's you know, people just see what an enormous difference they make. Obviously, there has been disruption in everything, right? And so there has been some funding that's helped in the short term. I think, you know, what happened in the pandemic to me is kind of, it shows that, you know, ultimately we're not going to let all our charities go to the wall, because ultimately we're not going to have the services that they provide. So, you know, making sure that the right support is there. But likewise, we can't sort of switch it all to taxpayer funded. They're charities, they're there for a reason, and they play an important role. But the British public are also extremely generous, and obviously, you know, I'm hopeful that as the care sector, you know, as everything reopens, effectively, we can start to do all the things that basically fund the charitable sector, all the events, all the shopping, whatever else we do. The other great thing is actually charity shops have become like a national thing. I don't know, has everyone noticed this? Is it just my family? It's become the national thing. Everybody actually wants now to whether it's recycling because it's environmentally friendly. It's I think there's a huge opportunity actually, because it's become certainly in my family, it's a national sport, which is how many things you can you know, get as a bargain from a charity shop. And I think that's more and more in the psyche of the British public. So and plus volunteering, you know, my nan volunteered in a charity shop until she was, you know, 92, you know, so I think that's another thing as well, as a lot more to give.
My mum's Irish, and she has a bag which she picked up in a charity shop for a complete bargain, which I think is her most prized possession.
Yeah.
That includes her children. So
yeah. It's obviously it was a designer bag.
Absolutely,
right?
no,
the bargain.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's lost on me, but I'm assured that it's a very, very fine bag indeed. Louise.
So I referenced earlier about levelling up, which is obviously the buzzword of the conference, I think, if you're going to all the fringes and hearing all of the speakers. But it's certainly something that we are very focused on in Essex, and the examples you've just given there are really, you know, great at what goes at the heart of why we're looking to do what we do, and we're very much approaching it from both a place perspective, but also looking at groups of people who are not just marginalised, but actually just don't have the opportunity to fulfil their potential, and that's a loss not just for individuals, but for all of us within our communities. And one of the groups that we are focusing on is people with learning disabilities and mental health issues. And it's about how we can support them, but also the wider communities. And it sort of links into the charities for me as well, because we're just starting to do some work with our partners around what that means in terms of work experience and job opportunities that we can give people. So we're not just, sat on panels like this advocating for it, but we're actually walking the walk as well and saying, well, we are, as Essex County Council, a huge employer. What is it that we can do to actually open opportunities for people, whether that's, some work experience or paid employment? And I think after the pandemic, particularly for young people, that's even more important. Across the piece, the last 2 years, young people have missed, the 2 weeks at the end of the summer term after the exams when they go and try and get a bit of work experience somewhere. And they've not had that for obvious reasons. And if you start to layer that then with challenges around autism or other learning disabilities, then that situation becomes even more acute. So very much looking at what we can do, but then also, as I say, speaking to partners and anchors within Essex to say, well, what is it that you can do? And we really are seeing people come forward. And if there's something that, maybe we can take away from the last couple of years that might have more of a positivity in terms of longevity, I think it is the relationships between the different parts in our communities. It is the council, it is looking at the third sector, it is thinking about how we've all supported each other and how we continue to do that. And in my own area, I've really seen that. And visiting there, it's an organisation run through the church where it started off as a food bank. They've now launched into a jobs club, gardening club for men with mental health, and they are providing work experience in the cafe there for youngsters with autism. So, really simple, really local example, but I just think we can build on that and do so much more. And I think sometimes we forget that in our own organisations we actually hold the solutions to some of this. It's more than just talking about it.
Caroline.
That sounds brilliant, and it links to what I was going to say, which is that I think the white paper that's coming on social care does have a desire that the people writing it do have a desire to think about social care in a much wider sense, much more about the role of the community, lower level support, new innovative ideas where people can help each other, or peer support, really important in the context of mental health, but lots of other groups to benefit as well. I'm sure including people with autism. So, that's going to be great. And I think with the integration white paper, that needs to be thinking about things like end-of-life care, the role of hospices. End-of-life care is incredibly patchy in this country. You can be awfully lucky. My mum died about 5 months ago, and it was horrible, but we were really, really well supported. She was by a fantastic hospice at home scheme from our local, rather well-known hospice, and also because there was a brilliant community-based palliative care team. But, I've met people in other parts of the country where there's virtually nothing, and we do have to do something about that. I mean, death is pretty universal, guys. We know it's coming, so let's deal with it properly. But that's also about getting the social care. That's a very important part of it for people in their last year of life. I think probably in practice, most social care actually is delivered to older people towards the end of their lives. So, we have to get that better. And that probably does mean putting hospices on a firmer financial footing. They are linchpins of excellence in our communities through which other services tend to spin off. And I know that with my own, the hospice I'm talking about, St Christopher's, which is very well known in London, they started off being the icing on the cake for palliative care. They're now holding the ring because other services have declined around them. And that's a shame, really. It still means I got a great service, but nonetheless, all the other things they wanted to do, they're now struggling to do. You have to change that, I think.
Okay, let's have hands up again. We'll take the gentleman in the corner there and the gentleman in the second row at the far end. Microphone's coming.
Hi, 43 years running care homes, family business, and 20 years on Norfolk County Council. I would like to be reassured that if I email you two ladies with some of my ideas, you might...
Sorry, could you just speak up a bit?
I said, say, if I emailed you both, I'd like to be reassured that I'd get some responses, because I've got a lot of ideas which are not about money. When I started in '79, it was a totally different world. The social people living longer, we all know the arguments. You've all seen it all. My question for you, thank you, is that could the government please be more responsive with the guidelines, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to justify some of the visiting issues. And there's none of us wearing a mask in here or in the conference, and when they're out and about in the street, it is becoming very challenging for our staff.
Thank you very much. And sir.
Thank you. Is that working?
That is working.
Excellent. Sorry. So parliamentary candidates are like a box of chocolates, and where you never know what you're going to get. And when Gillian Keegan rocks up to St Helens, we did really well. I know that she's new in the role, but she's very, very bright, and she really cares. I'm sure she'll master it. But we don't have a county council in St Helens or in Knowsley. We have very small populations in the boroughs, and we have borough councils trying to do social care for very small populations. Is that the right approach? Should we have a county council again?
Okay, well, maybe I think we're going to be reversing. So if we start with Caroline, and then work
Yeah,
downwards.
I mean, on providers, I can say this, Gillian can't because she wasn't there, but one of the things that happened during the pandemic was that providers got to have far more direct conversations with both ministers and officials in the department. I mean, I saw that, I was on the edge of that. And I think they're much better, there's much more understanding now in the department of what it's really like trying to operate successfully in the care business. And the people who are in charge of some of the membership bodies are absolutely key players who your guys are talking to all the time. So I think that's a really important advance. It wasn't like that in the past, and I think that should help create better policy that's more responsive to what's really going on. But on the issue of guidance, and particularly around visiting, I think you're very lucky, Minister, you missed a lot of that. It's so heartbreakingly difficult. Yeah. I mean, it's probably the hardest thing that we had to try and deal with, I would say, throughout the pandemic, which is how do you square off keeping people safe in a congregate setting like a care home with your understanding that, particularly for people with dementia, not seeing your loved ones is going to absolutely ruin their lives. And it's been heartbreaking for providers, incredibly difficult for officials. It's also been quite a political issue. And so one of the consequences of that is that the guidance has often come out rather late. But that, I'm pretty sure, is not the Department of Health's fault. It's because it's had to be cleared right the way across government at the last minute. But it's made it very, very difficult for everybody. And as we do now start to open up, I think it's time for another look at where we are. But at the moment, we acknowledge, I think everybody acknowledges that we have to do everything we can to avoid a repetition of what we saw earlier in the pandemic with 40,000 plus deaths of care home residents is something we can't see again. But we also have to acknowledge that the society is opening up and we have to let people see their relatives. It's happening in most places, not quite everywhere.
Please.
So I don't know the background, obviously, the structures that you've got locally, but if you ask me about most topics, I would be advocating for localism and decisions and powers to sit at the lowest level that was relevant and appropriate. But I do think when it comes to social care that having it at on a much bigger level, that there is mileage in that. Not just from the obvious things like purchasing powers, but in actual fact, to be a county council and as one as big as Essex, that it certainly does give us that opportunity to be more flexible in our approach, to try new things. And the reality is for small councils, particularly for something as significant as social care, and so expensive and so explosive in terms of the growth, to not have that flexibility, I think would be incredibly challenging. So I would certainly advocate that it would be at that higher level.
Well, first of all, on that topic, I think, obviously you and I have a similar view of Knowsley and St Helens Council, right? Having grown up with them. But I think the health and social care integration work is where we're going to try and have those discussions. What works? What's actually going to work for the local area? And I think that's, obviously it's up to councils how they kind of have their sort of unitary authorities. I mean, we've still got a county and 8 districts. I think you've probably got that in Essex as well. So there's lots of different, and then there's the borough model, obviously, which you see across your area. But I think the most important thing is to get the health and social care integration models right and at the right level. I hope that helps to answer it. In terms of your question, first of all, getting the insights that you have from your 43 years, and particularly the insights beyond the money. The one thing that's frustrating actually about being a politician is everybody who talks to you thinks that it's their job to just basically say we need more funding. I know everyone needs more funding. Everything I'll ever do in this job is going to involve more funding. But the lobby element of it, once you know that, it's not insightful. What's insightful is actually understanding how it's working on the ground, how it should work better on the ground, what your experience both from the history but also from the knowledge of the future. And I think, to me, that's where you get the answers. It's always where you get the answers. You don't get the answers by someone saying everything would be perfect if we had more money. I'm like, we're all here because of the challenges. And actually, leadership is there when you've got challenges, not when everybody's got loads of money. Actually, that's where leadership makes a massive difference. So I'll be very interested in working with you and others as well who have any ideas. Visiting, obviously, I've seen quite a few of the... I am awfully glad, Caroline, that I wasn't there as well, because it's most unbelievably difficult decisions. And all we ever looked at was thinking, and this is an awful thing to say, but, you know, thank God my nan was already gone, because the thought of not being able to see her when basically that's all she had is just unfathomable, and it's what lots and lots of people went through. And then, of course, you've got the other element, which, you know, every one of us went through, which is, you know, if somebody died and then you couldn't even go to their funeral, you couldn't be there to hold their hand at the end. I mean, just dreadful. And I think, the visiting, what we do about visiting now, I suppose we're getting to the point now where obviously we're opening up society. The care home staff are largely double jabbed, as are the residents, who are now going to be triple jabbed. So I think, I'll take that back actually to say, okay, what should we be looking at now? In terms of the guidance, I'm sure, again, it's probably difficult, and I'm sure through the pandemic there was so much that I can't imagine as well working in the Department of Health and Social Care was like during the pandemic. It must have been incredibly difficult with all the things they had to make decisions on, and obviously try to get that balance right. But we are now the other side of that, so I will take that as well as something to work with the officials on.
I'm sorry, yes. I'm going to have to be the mean chair.
Mean chair, yeah.
The mean chair. Otherwise, I just turn into a sort of supply teacher, and it gets very embarrassing. Hands, please. The gentleman in the third row there, and then the gentleman in the first row here. The microphones are on their way. So, thank you.
Hello. Bob Hughes, Surrey Area Conservatives. I also operate I run a charity delivering vision impaired and deaf services across Surrey. And we also have some contracts with the NHS, bits of the NHS. Just a plea, really, that procurement doesn't become the way that the NHS do it, for 2 reasons. One, frankly, I find it chaotic. And secondly, particularly chaotic in one case. And also, they don't really understand anything that happens outside the doors of the hospital. And constantly having to put things right for individuals, like, for instance, a lady in her 80s, the first thing her daughter knew she'd been discharged was at 5 in the morning when her mother rang her to say she'd been discharged. She's blind, by the way, so it wasn't very easy. The second thing is about specialisms. We offer specialist services. I operate specialist teams, deaf and vision impaired, and others. And in the County Council, they've created a learning difficulty and autism team that has absolutely transformed that service. Mm-hmm. It was not good quality. I think it is good quality now. And I think there are other areas where that could be the case, and I think that's worth pursuing. And the reason it's worth pursuing is because I think in some areas the phrase Care Act compliant is just a phrase, not actually compliant.
Thank you. Sir.
Councillor Mike Gibson from Bracknell. I also work for Eden Retirement Living. I'll pick up on a point that Gillian said about downsizing. There's a lot of retirement community building going on and developments going on, but they've got their own particular issues which they're trying to go through planning. Now, we work closely with Age UK. The local government, it's usually county, that are very supportive of this because it actually helps their finances, but the support from officers at district level is variable. So in your role, to actually increase the number of places that are available to downsizing, we'll be avoiding that silo-based thing of just being us and talking to your counterpart, Christopher Pincher from Tamworth, to actually try and help the situation with those planning issues.
Okay, we'll start with Gillian.
Yeah, completely agree, and that's. I think there's an opportunity there. First of all, the change that, again, has happened as a result of the pandemic, right? I mean, the change in some of the buildings that we find now in our high streets, the opportunity potentially to put two and two together and try to sort of figure out, because obviously, I mean, you know, what's the ideal? None of us want to go in a care home, right? None of us do. What's the ideal? The ideal is you could actually buy a place, downsize, release some capital that is actually going to be fit for your needs, probably in a town or village centre, and also has the support structures, and then maybe somewhere for you to go afterwards, right? Or if you've got a partner who's got, you know, is further ahead of the, my husband's there, so you'll have to look after me because I'll probably have dementia, because it's in our family. But you know, he can stay in the apartment, and I can be next door in something. Probably with a better service, but that's kind of that's obviously what we all want, right? That's obviously what we all want, and I think there's a real opportunity, actually, because the emptiness of the high street has all the pandemic's kind of sort of brought all this into close view. And I was actually there with James, actually, just the meeting before this, and I'm going to go out and look at some of the best practices, actually, that there are where, you know, some councils have done this, and how we can really consider how that becomes much simpler across, you know, what works, what are the business cases that work, what are the business models that work, and I will be happy to come along. I go on visits every Thursday. I've only been 2 weeks. I've already been to 4 places, but I will go on visits every Thursday, so I will get the view, you know, to be able to do that. In terms of the Surrey example, well, I mean, obviously, in terms of looking at the best practice in autism, I think best practice and seeing how, you know, Essex is now putting a lens on this. Probably, as you say, there was nothing that stopped doing it before, but it's, you know, so many things you do, but eventually it becomes into clear view. And I think, you know, more and more using the LGA to show some of the best practices in all of this area is really, really important, because that's actually what gives everybody else either the idea or the impetus to also focus on it. I think also integration and the whole view of the system is going to be so vital. And I know I say that almost in answer to everything, but it actually causes a lot of the problems. The procurement bill, I don't know quite what's going to happen, but I'm hopeful. I actually worked in procurement for a long time, and I have a lot of sympathy for people in procurement in government, because it's like doing everything with your hands and legs tied. I mean, it's unbelievable what they have to go through. And I now understand that, because I just didn't want to be one of these people who criticised and not understanding the constraints they were under. So I'm hoping, actually, there is going to be some work on this, and this is actually probably something, you know, post-Brexit that we could potentially look at, you know, because do we actually need to have it as complex as it is? And I'm hopeful that that might lead to some better practice and make it easier for people to procure sensibly.
Louise?
So planning, I mean, it's hard to think of a process that's more complex, cumbersome, and frankly unfathomable than what we have in this country when it comes to planning and seeking planning permission, but also doing it on a very much a planned basis. You know, prior to the role I'm in now, I was the leader of the Borough Council in Brentwood for 10 years, and prior to that I was also in had the role of chair of the planning committee, which was a role I tried to get out of as quickly as I can tell you. So I have seen this from sort of all different angles, and it just doesn't work. And if you look at it as a process, it fails. And if you look at it from people, it fails. You know, planning isn't just about building houses. It is about planning the whole community that we live in. And it should be about reflecting the needs of how we live our lives. And, you know, we're living longer, people are living longer with complex conditions. And I don't think the planning system has caught up with that and actually reflects what it needs to be in order for us to obviously live how we want to live. So I think it's, you know, broader than just retirement homes, it goes right the way across the system. And if ever there was anything that the government could, rip up and start again, I would suggest it would be planning, because it really doesn't work. And I think that, the further we go with this, and the ambition, which clearly we all have, from the government right down to local level, in terms of the support we give, not just for social care, but for our communities to be the way in which we want and need them to be. If we don't get a grip of the planning process, then we're not going to be able to deliver on it in the long term.
Caroline?
Yeah, I won't add to the woe on planning, but on the other issues around procurement, I think integration can't just mean doing everything that the NHS does and at the moment and spreading it to social care as well, because that just really wouldn't work very well. So hopefully we can get the best out of both rather than a race to the bottom, as it were. But secondly, I think there's an example was given of a really fantastic bit of local practice, and we're not as good as we should be really in spreading that sort of excellence right around the country. You can even have two adjacent areas where one's doing really well and the other not so well at all. And we're quite insular, I think. We're not very good at looking abroad, and we're not very good even in our own country at learning from other different areas, different people. So I think a bit more impetus around that would be really, really helpful.
Okay, hands up again, please. We'll have the gentleman in the front over there and gentleman right at the back over there. Microphone's one right. So you've got the microphone first. Yeah, I was going to say, go.
Hi. Graham Bridgman, Deputy Leader of West Berkshire Council, and currently portfolio holder for health and wellbeing, but until 6 months ago I had the adult social care portfolio. And I want to just bring this back to the politics and the money. We're all out in 23. We raised council tax for 21-22 by one of the 5 lowest council tax increases in the country. But we don't see that happening again. Because it's all very well saying you've got to pay 1.5%, the money's going to the NHS. Fine, I understand that. I'm governor of 2 trusts. But in between now and 24-25, when we might start to see some of that filter into social care, we are going to be going out on the doorstep, having to put on the adult social care precept in full in order to balance the books. And even then we won't balance the books. We're still going to, even doing that, we've still got to save 5 mil. That's the Chancellor's got to put his hand in his pocket and help local government. I mean, we spend 50% of our money on 6% of our population. And the other 94% understand that, but they still, when you say to them, we are going to increase council tax by above the rate of inflation, year in, year out, year on year, it's been happening for many years now.
Is there a question?
My question is, can we persuade the Chancellor to fund local government in social care in order that we don't have to look to our council taxpayers to do the job for him?
Thank you. The gentleman over there.
Hi, I'm Dave West from Health Service Journal. We've got there's some quite big reorganisations already going on in the health and social care system around integration. The health and care bill going through with integrated care systems set up next year, and all the complex funding reforms that are taking place on social care. What do you think? And these are various reviews and papers going forward: social care spending review, leadership, and efficiency reviews. What do you think the integration white paper, in particular, which is proposed, should add to all this?
If we start with you, gentlemen.
Okay. First of all, I definitely feel your pain, and it's a difficult set of decisions. I remember going through it myself as a councillor and thinking, you're trying to do the right thing by keeping the increases low, and then 2 years later you think that was the wrong thing. I should have just put it up, and I would have had 2 or 3 years worth of not getting further difficulties, and that's part of the challenge, right? That you have. The Chancellor obviously has got probably the world's worst job, actually, in terms of trying to figure out how we balance anything with massive more needs, loads of things that haven't been done in the past, lots of waste, let's be honest, we know, a lot of waste, and 407 billion that we've spent that we weren't quite expected to spend. So it's the worst job in the world. I don't know, but here in this plan, this September Build Back Better plan, it says the government will ensure local authorities have access to sustainable funding for core budgets at the spending review. We expect demographic and unit cost pressures will be met through council tax, social care precept and long-term efficiencies. That's actually, you know, the clue is there, I think. So whether, and I understand, you know, there's a lot of debate and discussion, and it's a more difficult thing. And obviously people are now, you never used to notice council tax quite as much. You really notice it now, don't you, because of you know, these increases that have happened. But I read that, and I don't know what he's going to do, but it seemed to me that that's pretty indicative. And in terms of the integration white paper, I don't know what else needs to be added, but I think there's quite a lot of there's still quite a lot that we can do, and we can do better. I think it's a staged process. So obviously you've got the bill, which is going to deliver some of the levers and some of the capability in terms of data sharing, etc. But really what it really takes is leadership locally. I went to something recently. It was in Liverpool. And my mum and dad are still there, so I went along after I'd seen them to a visit. And the big breakthrough, which was really great, it was actually mental health. And the big breakthrough was basically the CCG, the local council, 2 local councils, the NHS mental health services, and a whole load of different charities and community groups all working together to put together a much better service. And the big insight was that. And I sat there and said, what stopped you working together before? What on earth stopped you when you've got all these people in front of you who, you know, and actually a lot of them are kids I went to school with. The suicide rate of men between 45 and 55, I'm 53 now, of the kids I went to school with is shocking. You know, we have a funeral a month near enough of somebody whose life just didn't turn out as they expected. I'm like, this is staring you in the face. What stopped you working together before when there's such a need? And actually I'm going to challenge everybody on that, because budget brinkmanship, control, trying to, you know, territorial turf wars, you know, that's not going to help serve the people that we are there to serve. And their needs are getting more and more acute as we sit and do talk to ourselves in some cases. So I think, and they basically said, I feel we ought to have done it before. And I think, you know, what's stopping us doing it? There's nothing stopping it happening. I've tried to go through it with my own, because I was a governor as well on a NHS trust as well as being a councillor, and you try to go through this and you see, and effectively it's leadership, it's insecure leadership that stops it, and it's secure leadership that makes it happen. And I think that's actually what we need to expect of our local leaders. But the integration will give us hopefully the space to be able to work through those and to ensure that we do better on that. Because, you know, discharging somebody who's blind at 5 a.m. in the morning is unacceptable, unsafe, and probably, not necessary, if only the systems work better together. So I think it is key, but we can't stop until it's really at the best.
Louise?
So just first of all, on the question of money, like every council up and down the country, we're all sitting there in Essex at the moment looking at how we're going to balance the budget next year and beyond. And next year's not actually the challenging year, it's the year after. But very much in the space really of your interpretation. We've had various discussions around how willing to listen government would be if we went asking for more money, and I think that if we weren't making use of the tools that are at our disposal, which does include tax increases, I'd imagine that would be a pretty short conversation that we would have. That's not saying that I don't get the politics of it. Of course I do, and it sort of goes full circle to what we were saying earlier about the question of the social care precept and how far you can push that, and that is about, to an extent, political choices, certainly local leadership in terms of what the pitch is, what the sale is, and how you're explaining to people what that means. But it's not easy. But just turning to what Gillian was just saying there about local leadership, I think you're spot on. And we've all seen it in various ways around how people get so caught up in not just their boundary, but their title and the structure and the governance. And we're doing some work in Essex with our partners, trying to sort of rehash a so-called partnership board that has to be frank, worked to varying degrees over the past few years, and to actually make it meaningful. And straight away, people want to talk about governance. And I said, no, leave that at the door. What do we want to do here? What do we want to achieve? And how do we work backwards to make us in a place where we can actually do that? And I think that, that's the responsibility of all of us in this space, whether you're, an official leader, a deputy leader, or whatever it is, that if we're going to seriously work together, we have to look at the outcome that we want, and then think about what our role is in terms of how we achieve that.
Caroline.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, so I'm happy to pass.
Oh, okay, wonderful. In which case,
Cheers.
not wonderful. I mean, gracious.
It is wonderful.
Gracious. We have time, I think, probably, depending on how things go, for one more round of questions. So if I could have a final show of hands, please. The lady there, yes, and then the gentleman in the front row. If we have time.
Hi, my name is Ishmael, and I work for MainCap. I know money is a problem for everybody, and also social care is one area of a money problem, but I feel that rising council tax and also rising national insurance, I don't think it's the only one area that will solve the problem of social care, but I think the Chancellor needs to look at other things that can give to people bad health, for example, like cigarettes, alcohol, costs, that things can rise. NHS bills are high, and so I think the Chancellor really needs to look at things that are not really important, that can increase, like alcohol bills and cigarettes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. The lady there. And then can we get the microphone to the local government gazette? Why not? I don't think we're going to get another round of questions in, so we might as well just do three. So,
Tony Horain, mother of an autistic child who lost her best friend in the pandemic, who was 93 years old, because he couldn't go to hospital because they wouldn't take him. The carers come with no infection control. That's got to be education. And I think across the board, when we look at people who've died in care, is because they didn't understand that infection control starts with washing hands, wearing masks, and not passing it on to other people. So if I can make one plea, that it's not just about the money, it's about how we care for everybody.
okay, thank you very much. And closing words.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to ask you, I mean, obviously the public imagination is very much gripped by the petrol shortages, which are caused by shortages of haulier drivers, but what I'm hearing from the social care sector is that there are also, there's been massive workforce shortages caused by the same thing, basically, Europeans leaving, which has caused problems with getting people from care homes for day trips because there's not enough drivers, and in the catering sector, as well as obviously shortages of carers. And just wanted to know whether that's something that you're aware of, and that you do see that there's a massive pressure in workforce shortages, which possibly hasn't been raised as much in the public arena, but is going on.
Wonderful, thank you. So if we start with Caroline and just work our way up the panel.
So I'm just going to pick up the one about lessons from the pandemic, essentially. And at some point there'll be an inquiry, and there is quite a lot to learn. And actually, we changed the title of this fringe meeting at the last minute after the Prime Minister made his announcement. We were going to call it, "What should we learn from the pandemic about the future of social care?" But we felt that we needed to reflect on the Prime Minister's announcement as the hook, really. But I think there is quite a lot to learn. And I think the truth is we're not terribly good at it. We haven't been historically very good at infection control in either our hospitals or in our care homes. And we've had to learn a lot very quickly. And it's incomparably better than it ever was, but we have to sustain it. We can't any longer put up with the idea that thousands and thousands of people die every year from flu in care homes. That's partly because we haven't been good enough at infection control. We haven't got the vaccination rates up enough. So, I think that there is, being positive, there's a better place we can get to drawing on what we've learned through the pandemic.
Louise?
So coming back to the question around obviously staffing, pre the pandemic, we identified a scheme in Essex which we've just termed the Nightingale Nurses, where we effectively have provided bursaries for Essex-based people who want to go and study nursing. And we're now looking at how we could extend that into social care and domiciliary care to provide some additional support around training. But I just wanted to pick up really on your point around kind of the broader aspect, I suppose. We talk about tax, we talk about what we can do to square the circle and what that means for social care and for homes. But we don't really talk about how we can just all live a healthier society, live as a healthy community. So tax is, of course, part of that. There's money has to happen in one way or another. I think the point around sustainable communities and recognising some of our carers and what that can mean, and the work that certainly we in local government can do to help strengthen those areas so they can start to be in a place where they can effectively begin to help themselves and support others. We've got a scheme running called Find Your Active, because it will come as no surprise that after the pandemic people have been very sedentary. And this isn't necessarily about running around and playing football now. It could just be about walking to the shops or doing some gardening just to get people up and moving. And we've found some ambassadors from all walks of life to try and infiltrate into some of the harder reach people, to encourage them just to get active. And then using our library service for what we're calling shelf help, which is all focused on mental health support. Mm-hmm. So the point I'm making in all of this is that the answer to all of this, I think, is much broader than just about how we fund social care. It has to be about how we can live much healthier lives, and we're all responsible for ourselves in that sense. And I'm not sure that really as a society and as a community that we're really in that space where we do have those open and honest discussions, whether it's smoking, whether it's drinking, whether it is just being more active. But what does that mean for our own well-being and our own health as individuals and more broadly as communities? And I think that's something that's often missed, and I'd like to see more discussion around that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, prevention is massively important. Mental health, mental wellness is also going to make a massive difference. And we've had this ambition, right, parity of esteem between mental and physical health. But we've been at the physical health side since 1948, still got lots of problems, right? Diabetes and all the sort of lifestyle aspects of it. But we've certainly got a huge opportunity to improve how we the conversation we have, but actually also the support we have to ensure that we all have mental wellness. I asked Chris Whitty, actually, I met him and said, what can I do? My family, everyone's got dementia. We either live long, we live quite long, but we all get dementia. And there's lots of people in my family who have dementia. And he said, diet and exercise. He said it's the answer to everything. It's the answer to aging, in a healthy way. And we all know this, right? But we still don't do it. We don't shelf help. In fact, we do. We probably get the books. We don't do anything that's written in them. But I wonder whether the thing that's always I've been thinking about as well with technology is actually the insights that potentially some of the next generation of wearables, if you actually knew, that next drink, what it was actually doing, or that cigarette, what it was actually doing, no one would do the things that we do. The reason we do them is we all think that it's not us. We're not going to be the ones that are going to be affected. We're not going to have the mental health problem. We're not going to have cancer. You always think it's someone else, right? And I think that's something that I'm interested in, but it is actually a huge opportunity, and it'll be something that we'll be doing till the day we're all dead and beyond, right? Because it's never ending. In terms of the situation about the lorry drivers, you mentioned the lorry drivers. I arrived a little bit late on Sunday for my first panel, and I said to them, actually, it comes to something when the shortest queue I've been in today was the queue for petrol, because actually the queue to get you past, the queue to get into the hotels was like a disaster. So I actually spoke in my old job to the Haulage Association. I put in place apprenticeship schemes from April this year, and we did a lot of things to try and help them to get the talent pipeline going. And effectively what happened, there's a bit of lots of different things. There's some European workers that have gone back home, some have stayed. We've got 6.2 million people who stayed from Europe, so an awful lot did stay. A few went back and a few didn't come back afterwards, but 6.2 million stayed. But actually really what happened was there was a massive surge in demand because we all started buying things at home and being at home. The surge in the demand and the operating models that sprouted up as a result of that meant, and we all have it, we have 7 deliveries a day. And I said to them, how much are you working with Argos, how much are you all working together so I don't get 7 deliveries a day? Have you actually changed your operating models to try and release some of this pressure? Sheepishly, they said, no, that's something they all have to do. And then the driving test, we closed the driving tests for the whole of the pandemic. So there's thousands of people who are actually waiting to get in. So there's a number of things. One of the things I found interesting when I first became an NHS board governor, the very first meeting I went to, they'd all just come back from the Philippines. This is in Chichester. I'm thinking, what are you doing in the Philippines? I've been to Tokyo in the Philippines. And they said, we've gone recruiting nurses. And I said, what are you doing there recruiting nurses? They said, well, we've already depleted the availability of the Spanish and the Portuguese nurses. I said, well, what about, the people who are here who'd love to go into this profession? And it just struck me as just bizarre, unbelievably inefficient, and also wrong and just bizarre. A couple of weeks later, I was in Tokyo because I went to. I used to work in Tokyo for a couple of years, and I went there on actually a trip with my husband because he was working there. And I went to the Japanese diet, and I met the health minister, and he said to me, "We've just come back from the Philippines. We're recruiting all our nurses from the Philippines." I thought, Jesus, we've got Tokyo and Chichester competing for the Filipino nurse population. How stupid is that? So I put a lot of effort when I became Apprenticeships and Skills Minister into making sure we had all the apprenticeship models. Apprenticeship models are a fabulous model. First of all, for providing kids with opportunity that they don't normally get, and secondly, adults to retrain later on if they want a second career. And many people want a second career in this area. We've now got 70 apprenticeship different routes in, and the nursing apprenticeship starts from being 0 and now 18,000 this year. That's what we should be doing. And anybody who doesn't act strategically to attract the talent, and it's not always about pay, actually, it's not really. Mostly you want to feel that you love your job, you've got purpose, it's really appreciated, you're recognised. Obviously your pay needs to be good enough, and all these ridiculous things like 0 hours contracts and the person at the bottom of the food chain taking all the risk is wrong. But actually, I think this is where companies need to step up. And I've worked for 30 years in business, and I wouldn't expect any of the things that I see. I wouldn't expect that from anybody I've ever employed. So, it's easy to blame a lot of this on various things. What you need to do is actually work strategically to really value the people. People are the only asset any business ever has, and more need to see that.
Right, that brings us to the end of our time. I think it just falls to me to thank all of you for showing up and asking so many interesting questions, and to join me in showing a show of appreciation for our panel. Conservative Home are running a few more events today. I don't think we've got any tomorrow, but we've got a few more today, so hopefully you'll turn up for some of those either in the tent or here. Have a very good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.